Да, друзья, рады всех видеть в аудитории и в Zoom. У нас третий день, конец третьего дня нашей секции «Политическое сообщество по ту сторону аналитической континентальной философии». Многое мы успели, как я уже говорил раньше, обсудить. И финальный доклад третьего дня будет прочитан Борисом Масловым, доцентом университета Осло, и он будет прочитан по-английски, и он называется Transhistorical Community or Civilizational Continuity, the case for the abolition of the death penalty. Борис, the floor is yours. Пожалуйста. Да, час, соответственно, как распределить внутрь время, абсолютно на ваше усмотрение.
Хорошо, спасибо большое. Коллеги, я не знаю, есть ли среди слушателей те, кто не знает русского. Я предполагаю, что все прекрасно владеют английским. И тем не менее, чтобы упростить восприятие текста, который не очень прост именно для восприятия со слуха, потому что там много имен незнакомых, я вместо того, чтобы подготовить презентацию, предлагаю такой вариант. Я просто буду читать текст, и этот текст будет на экране. Тогда те, кто, может быть, какие-то имена так упустил бы, может быть, что-то и заметит. А можно мне поделиться экраном, Никита?
Да, конечно. Да, у вас как это?
Есть, да, такая возможность?
Да, в Zoom демонстрация экрана. Внизу зеленая.
Угу. Вот сейчас видно, да?
Да, мы все видим. Да.
Окей. Так. Надо только избавиться вот от этой вот. Вот не знаю, вам мешает сейчас смотреть на текст то, что поверх, или нет? Или все видно?
Да, все видно, ничего не мешает. То есть, да, двухстраничный такой формат, правильно?
Ну вот я бы хотел, чтобы он был одностраничный, если честно, но что-то я уже испортил.
Может быть, внизу масштабирование, коллеги говорят.
Внизу, хорошо.
Вот. Где ползунок внизу, в правом углу. В правом углу. Посередине. Нет, левее. Иконка одной страницы.
Вот это, да?
Да, вот все, теперь...
Ну хорошо, отлично. So the first section has the title Transhistorical Communities and Those Who Studied Them. Beginning with Petrarch's letters to the ancients, elevating representations of imaginary contact between the great author and a posthumous reader have been a staple of humanist and humanistic discourse. A book is like a friend, and as Wayne Booth put it in his essay on this metaphor, friendly talk about literary friendship becomes, like that friendship itself, one of life's goals. Needless to say, interaction with books is not always a private matter, however enriching it may be. The interest in the past displayed by the moderns is only partly inherited from the humanist ideal of antiquity reborn. In Europe, newly emerging bourgeois states were founded on a medieval past and a body of romantic literature designed to make that past and thereby the nation visible. The essential role that literature has played in constructing the imagined communities of nation-states has been brought into focus by Benedict Anderson. Transhistorical communities do not, however, have to be imagined in Anderson's sense of the word, so large as to rule out meaningful contact between most of their members. On the spectrum between one-on-one elucibrations and collective cults, one finds communities that include multiple living and dead interlocutors inhabiting different historical periods. One may often have no wish to befriend Shakespeare, so much as to be in the company of those who held Shakespeare dear. What makes Shakespeare appear sociable are the meanings that his corpus has accumulated during its reception, within what Bakhtin called the Great Time. Such communities may be artistic, professional, sectarian, ad hoc, or all of these at the same time, and one person may inhabit many transhistorical communities that only intersect in her or himself. These may or may not be generative of new meanings. Some, like Cicero's phantasmatic Scipionic circle, are celebrated even to the point of being mistaken for a historical fact. Others, as in the case considered in this study, are of momentous significance but unadvertised and hence overlooked. From the perspective of the social sciences, such transhistorical interactions represent something of an absurdity, a travesty of man's nature as a political animal. Citing Don Quixote, Pierre Bourdieu speaks of a hysteresis effect that obtains when an individual inhabits a pathologically non-synchronous time. There is a comic potential to situations where a book is not only one's sole friend, but a hideout from discomforting reality. In one of Alexander Herzen's unfinished early novellas, Duty Above All, Долг превыше всего, a progressively minded French tutor accompanying young Russian aristocrats traveling from St. Petersburg happens to arrive in his own home city of Paris in the year 1789 and is near by protesters who are convinced that he is an enemy of the people. Back at his hotel, he lay down on the bed. This is my translation, and just I'm not quite sure everybody knows Russian, so I'll read in translation. Back at his hotel, he lay down on the bed, asked for some kind of tisane to be prepared for him, and for the first time admitted to himself that he would have given a lot to be on the barbaric but quiescent banks of the Neva. Tisane helped, he began to recover, and was about to read in Livy about the people's revolt against Tarquinius the Elder, when a rifle volley rang out, a cannon thundered, and then again and again individual shots followed. Now and then a drum and a distant rumble was heard. Both the rumble, the drum, and the shots, it seemed, were coming closer. People in workmen's clothes ran down the street shouting, "À la Bastille, à la Bastille." Herzen's description of the events on the streets of Paris was the reason for the novella's rejection by the Russian publisher. One of the editors even hypothesized that Herzen had gone mad if he expected to see his matter-of-fact treatment of the French Revolution in print in Russia under Nicholas I. Like his character in this passage, Herzen was, in his own way, out of step with history, working toward a socialist revolution that he knew could not come to pass in his lifetime, and that eventually would materialize in a shape that had as little to do with his visions as the French Revolution had to do with the assassination of Tarquin, masterminded by the previous king's sons. In his 1860 essay on the British social reformer Robert Owen, Herzen spoke of those condemned to be misunderstood and even ridiculed by the masses because they are ahead of their time in understanding and upholding the interests of the masses. In the 20th century, Herzen's works would serve as an equivalent of Livy to those trying to make sense of and mitigate new historical traumas. Beside the professional humanist, the comical retrograde, and the proleptic progressive, the typology of transhistorical communities includes more oppressive and nefarious varieties. School canons of authors, pre-selected to be enjoyed by everyone aspiring to full nationality or to the membership in a social elite, can be both an aid and a hindrance to forging individual friendships with books. Such imposed companionships, however, generally leave open a cosmopolitan backdoor into the broader pastures of Weltliteratur. A far more tyrannical transhistoricism enters the picture with the Spenglerian concept of civilization, which persists on the margins of scholarly discourse, reflecting its continued popularity outside of the academia. In an article published in 2023, Yuri Sloskin, one of the most respected authorities on Soviet history, chose to found his reflections on the ongoing world crisis on the definition of civilization proposed by William McNeill, the author of The Rise of the West, A History of the Human Community, published in 1963, a definition which Sloskin applies to the list of civilizations taken from Samuel Huntington's The Clash of Civilizations and the Remaking of the World Order from 1993. Thus, conjuring a select community of intellectuals bravely thinking on a global scale, Sloskin draws conclusions that seem apropos in a Russian journal currently serving as a forum for the spread of the officially approved narrative about the ongoing war in Ukraine as a civilizational clash between Russia and the West. In McNeill's book, Civilization, this is my translation from Sloskin's Russian. In McNeill's book, civilization is defined as the largest community united by a shared literary canon and notions of human behavior formed by this canon. To function successfully, such a community needs institutions and professionals who preserve, maintain, and interpret this canon. If by way of experiment we apply this definition to Huntington's list of world civilizations, it will transpire that the Chinese, Japanese, Hindu, and Islamic are undoubtedly civilizations, the African and Latin American are undoubtedly not civilizations, the Orthodox is not quite a civilization, whereas Western civilization is in the past. As Sloskin explains, Western civilization is in the past because its literary canon is no longer unitary or even taken seriously by those who are charged with maintaining it. In fact, it has become far too fragmented, flimsy, and thin-layered, after the spread of nationalism which saw individual countries setting up their own canons. More recently, and specifically in the United States, even the term Western civilization has lost currency among historians. While the West is thus yet again in decline, Russia's prospects, according to Sloskin, look dim as well, because it is much too indebted to the West and lacks the depth of autonomous civilizational development seen in China, India, or Persia, or the coherence, wholeness, and purposefulness of Islam. In short, the American professionals have failed the West, and as a result, Russia suffers. As regards the substance of Sloskin's argument, suffices to mention that the key definition of civilization Sloskin attributes to McNeill's original book is in fact an inaccurate rephrasing of McNeill's current views from a retrospective essay written for a republication almost 3 decades later. In fact, Sloskin's emphasis on autochthonous canons and the boons of civilizational autarky are entirely at odds with the argument of McNeill's book, which stresses contact and cultural interaction. The proposition accepted as an axiom by Sloskin that canons are best kept unchanged, or even that their stability makes cultures more worthy of the status of civilization, attests to a kind of non plus ultra of transhistorical collectives imagined to coalesce around texts. In fact, even when it's restricted to a canon of sacred writings, the individual still retains the freedom of navigating a corpus that, like the Hebrew and the Christian Biblia books, is plural and often contradictory. Guidance is offered in Plutarch's treatise, How the Young Person Should Listen to Poets, that points out inconsistencies in the two Homeric epics, which were the center of the school canon in the Greek-speaking world for millennia. Plutarch views the aim of early education as the development of sharp hearing, Oxyokoya, describing with a musical metaphor the reader's ability to compare passages, marshal parallels from other poets, and even extract edifying meanings from passages that ostensibly say something else. Instead of direct indoctrination, literature, even at its most canonical, trains the young person to draw non-trivial conclusions, which are ostensibly her own, although in fact shared by a collective of hoi papaidoimeno, the educated. More often than not, values are not norms to be extracted from texts, like Hesiod's prohibition against undressing at nighttime, or the Mosaic commandment not to kill. Rather, they derive from prevalent practices of reading and interpretation, which in turn are contingent on how transhistorical communities are constructed within a given socio-cultural milieu. Modes of transhistorical communication may change while the canon remains stable and vice versa. Whenever a historian posits continuities that span an extended period of time, a second-order transhistorical community is created, of which that very historian is a self-elected member. This does not imply that the continuity being uncovered is not real or not empirically verifiable. What bears emphasis, however, is that it is not conditioned by a preset menu of texts. A particularly haphazard assembly of individuals stands behind an idea widely regarded today as constituting a moral and even a civilizational value, that the death penalty is an inappropriate form of punishment to be abolished as a matter of principle. Historians of law are univocal in foregrounding one text as having exerted a defining influence on modern perceptions, Cesare Beccaria's On Crimes and Punishments, in 1764. Freely combining references to natural law with occasional use of the theory of social contract, in a manner that, while philosophically inconsistent, was perhaps all the more effective for the impression of a conclusive synthesis that it produced on the wider public. On Crimes and Punishments, first and foremost, succeeds rhetorically. Rather than presenting a continuous exposition, it is composed of brief, lucid, and stylistically accomplished chapters that jump between topics. While Beccaria uses this free-ranging essay form to inveigh against many practices that he sees as archaic survivals, such as the use of torture or the criminal persecution of adultery, it was his sustained argument that the death penalty must never be applied in a time of peace that struck contemporaries most. In Discipline and Punish, Michel Foucault placed Beccaria's work in the context of the rise of new penitentiary practices of incarceration and surveillance, which replaced the public spectacles of execution. The new episteme, according to Foucault, was designed to extract maximum utility from crime, and Beccaria's recurrent appeals to the overcoming of barbarism and the furthering of l'humanità are no more than tokens of ideological false consciousness, cloaking a new system of oppression. In a series of moves reminiscent of Carl Schmitt, Foucault proposes that humanity is the respectable name given to this economy and its meticulous calculations, and then the figure of the delinquent, produced by the modern carceral continuum, replaced the adversary of the sovereign as the social enemy, a monster vomited by nature. Foucault combined daring generalizations with a principled disregard for the contingent and meandering itineraries of ideas. One could agree with the claim of Discipline and Punish that all juridical practices that foreground correction of criminals belong to the same episteme, but nevertheless doubt that this episteme can be sealed off from all kinds of things, including the medieval practice of confession, which Foucault himself in his later work regarded as constitutive of the mode of the Western subjectivity. In particular, Foucault's analysis does not allow us to come to grips with the paradox that although Beccaria's call to abolish the death penalty created a major sensation, it was not heeded. While On Crimes and Punishment lent intellectual legitimacy to the abolitionists, the argument failed to carry the day in Europe until well into the 20th century. A telling case is Britain, where support for such a reform was strong in the 1840s but declined by the late 1860s. The retributionist idea that death is the only adequate penalty for murder long remained a matter of communis opinio, a fact that undermines Foucault's vision of a watershed moment in the decades around the French Revolution. Put simply, ideas take too long to percolate for any episteme to contain them. While the story of the reception of Beccaris' treatise, beginning with Voltaire and Bentham, as well as the later criticism of the death penalty by the likes of Dickens and Tolstoy, are both familiar subjects, Beccaris' own predecessors remain unexplored. This is no accident. His argument against the death penalty emerged out of a highly contingent, unlikely transhistorical synchronization. While On Crimes and Punishments is generally reticent about its sources, the following passage is an exception. If centuries of experience, said Beccaria, during which the ultimate punishment has never deterred man determined to harm society, if the example of the citizens of Rome, or the 20-year reign of the Empress Elizabeth of Muscovy, during which she gave the leaders of all people, that illustrious example, worth at least as much as many conquests bought with the blood of her country's sons, if none of this has convinced man, for whom the voice of reason is always suspect while the voice of authority is compelling, then it suffices to consult human nature in order to appreciate the truth of my assertion. Of the 4 points Beccaria makes here, the first 3, the centuries of experience demonstrating the ineffectiveness of the capital punishment, the Roman example, the precedent of the Empress Elizabeth of Russia, are presented as compelling enough for those who heed the voice of reason. The argument about human nature is meant for the less enlightened who obey the voice of authority. There is a curious irony in the fact that the first 3 arguments are shaped like distinct auctoritates, which do not call for discussion and cannot be disputed, while Beccaria's appeal to human nature, designed for those less prone to thinking, is the only one that takes the form of a rational argument. It states that the human soul is more easily habituated to the terrible but fleeting spectacle of a criminal's death than to the long and arduous example of a man deprived of his liberty and reduced to the state of a beast of burden. Following the logic of dehumanization in the name of humaneness, which Foucault has uncovered, but retaining an emphasis on the spectacle, in spite of what Foucault says, Beccaria suggests that the death penalty should be laid aside because it's less traumatic for the onlookers than forced labor. We will come back to this point, but for now, let us note that this is merely one of the 4 pieces of Beccaria's argumentation expressly unrelated to the other 3. The personage that receives most attention in this passage is Elizabeth, the daughter of Peter the Great. In On Crime and Punishment, Beccaria's praise of Elizabeth is part of a pattern, whereby practices introduced in the Enlightened Age furnish proof of the moral and philosophical validity of ideas they make manifest. This meta-historical tautology is evident in Beccaria's reference to the abolition of torture in contemporary Sweden. Yet, as also in the passage about the death penalty, the modern case against torture is buttressed by an ancient exemplum, the Roman legislators, for whom the use of torture was to be limited to slaves who were denied the status of persons. The transhistorical nexus is similar. It combines a modern witness and an ancient precedent. The latter functions according to the logic of Historia Magistra Vitae, history as a reservoir of exemplar. The former implies a different temporality inherent in history as a process of enlightenment and moral amelioration. Beccaria bridges the 2 ideas of history distinguished by Reinhard Koselleck, another theorist who, like Foucault in Discipline and Punish, regarded the end of the 18th and the beginning of the 19th centuries as a time of profound conceptual transformation. Naturally, this is not how Beccaria considered modernity in 1764. For him, the triumphs of the 18th century were part of a protracted development which necessarily included progressive reforms in Britain. In Beccaria's case against torture, this country supplies one more proof of as a nation whose glory in letters, superiority in commerce, and in wealth leave no doubt as to the goodness of its laws. But no continuity of tradition links these individual auctoritates. The Romans, Elizabeth of Russia, the British, and the Swedes all stand on their own. Beccaria's method is primarily rhetorical, specifically juridical, whereby persuasion is achieved by a collection of individual proofs, or tekmeria, as Aristotle defines them, which have a cumulative impact on the audience. In the case of the example of the citizens of Rome, the stress should be laid on the word citizens. Beccaria follows Montesquieu, who cites ancient Rome in support of his claim that there is a correlation between legal practice and system of government. Livius' pronouncement that the Romans may take pride in the fact that no other nation preferred milder punishments, according to Montesquieu, only holds for the Republican period. In the same context, Montesquieu cites a lex Porciana that banned the death penalty for citizens. Sources mention laws that prohibit flogging of citizens and permitted commuting the capital punishment to exile through an appeal procedure. Even under the Republic, however, according to modern scholars, it seems to have been members of the elite who could profit from the concession of exile. Common criminals were likely to be killed or rendered virtual slaves. The significance attached to a half-fantasized Roman prohibition points to the humanist lining of the argument for milder punishments. Voltaire, in his commentary on Beccaria's treatise, declared, "A Roman citizen would only be condemned to die for crimes that affected the security of the state. Our masters, our first legislators, respected the blood of their fellow countrymen. We squander the blood of ours." As for Elizabeth, her sudden decision to abolish the death penalty was an enigma both to her subjects and to foreign observers, particularly as it caused a considerable logistical nuisance, with government officials called upon to improvise near-lethal, in fact, lethal labor conditions for thousands who would otherwise be executed. Widely regarded as an absurdity and gendered as a female caprice, something that Beccaria's language of fathers and sons plays on, Elizabeth's refusal to sign off on death sentences came to be explained by a religious vow that she supposedly made on the eve of the coup that brought her to power. Historians, for lack of a better explanation, long held on to this legend. As Sergei Palskoy has recently demonstrated in an article that I recommend in NLO 2023, there could not have been any vow, if only because Elizabeth introduced the ban 2 years after the coup. The true reason must be sought once again in an aspiration to imitate the Romans. As Palskoy shows, Elizabeth, in part inspired by her interest in French neoclassical drama, consistently modeled her behavior on the Roman precedent, yet an imperial, not a republican one. A key figure was Vespasian's son, Titus, who reigned for 2 years only, but in a manner that, perhaps by contrast with his brother Domitian, who succeeded him, seemed exceptionally humane. According to Suetonius, Titus pronounced that he would rather perish himself than cause death to another person. This adage was included in Justus Lipsius's Moneta et Exempla Politica, translated into Russian in 1721. The guiding concept that informed Elizabeth's policy, once again I'm following Palskoy, was clementia, an idea made popular in the early modern period by Seneca's treatise. For her coronation in 1742, Elizabeth chose the opera La Clemenza di Tito to Pietro Metastasia's libretto. In his critique of the principle of clemency, which survives in some modern political systems, as we know, as the right of extrajuridical pardon that rests with the executive, Beccaria pointed out that it ceases to be relevant once the death penalty is entirely abolished. There are no grounds to impute similar reasoning to Elizabeth, who, in the face of opposition from her advisors, insisted that the capital punishment should not be part of Russia's law code. In this case, the demonstrative escalation of an autocrat's virtue came to resonate with a theory that looked back to the Republican ideal. In light of this, Palskoy's interpretation of Elizabeth's long-standing attitude towards the death penalty as a political strategy designed to deflect attention from her dubious claim to the throne lacks conviction. Instead, it seems most accurate to speak of a confluence of various factors and the merging of different voices, including the legacy of Peter's radical autocracy, imaginings of Roman emperors, ancient and modern Stoic text, and Orthodox religiosity. Within this unlikely transhistorical space, an extraordinary reform became thinkable. The sheer unpredictability of Elizabeth's move and Russia's peripheral position with respect to European civilization makes Beccaris' appeal to her counterintuitive. Without sharing the value of imperial clemency, he chooses to misrecognize Elizabeth's decision as one dictated by the voice of reason, while in fact using it as one more voice of authority. There is, in my view, another ancient figure lurking behind Beccaris' utilitarian philosophy of punishment, and that is Thucydides, the author of the History of the Peloponnesian War. The relevant portion of the history is the speech by Diodotus in Book 3, where Diodotus argues against executing all citizens of Mytilene as punishment for the city's failed revolt from the Athenian rule. I quote Hobbes' translation. "We contend not now, if we be wise, about the injury done by them, but about the wisest counsel for ourselves. For how great soever be their fault, yet I would never advise to have them put to death, unless it be for our profit, nor yet would I pardon them, though they were pardonable, unless it be good for the Commonwealth. And in my opinion, our deliberation now is of the future rather than of the present. I say, therefore, that death hath been, in states, ordained for a punishment of many offences, and those not so great, but far less than this. Yet encouraged by hope, men hazard themselves, and it is likely that gentler punishments were inflicted of old, even upon the most heinous crimes, but that in tract of time, men continuing to transgress, they were extended afterwards to the taking away of life, and yet they still transgress. And therefore either some greater terror than death must be devised, or death will not be enough for coercion. For poverty will always add boldness to necessity, and wealth, covetousness to pride and contempt. But hope and desire work this effect in all estates, and this hope as the leader, that desire as the companion, this hope contriving the enterprise, that desire suggesting the success, are the cause of most crimes that are committed. Again, this is the speech by Diodotus in Thucydides, translated by Thomas Hobbes. Diodotus' conclusion in the passage from Thucydides is in line with Beccaris' idea that crime should be combated through preventive measures. Whereas we ought rather not mightily to punish a free city revolted, but mightily to look to it before it revolt, and to prevent the intention of it. Again, Hobbes' translation of Thucydides. The reason for this is that the threat of certain destruction would make the culprit city persevere in resisting the imperial master. As Beccaria formulates this idea, the atrocity of a punishment itself and the greater evil the criminal faces makes him even bolder in trying to avoid punishment, and leads him to commit even more crimes in order to escape punishment for any single one of them. In the debate on the fate of Mytilene, Diodotus confronts Cleon, who insists on a retaliatory notion of justice. By contrast, Diodotus builds his case for not destroying the city on the notion of tox sympheron, expediency, or utility. Condemning all Mytileneans to death will only make it harder for Athens to govern her empire. In the history of humanity, the escalation of penalties served to render potential criminals insensitive to punishment. The reason for this is that individuals as well as cities are driven to commit crime by affects, the desire to improve their condition and the hope that they might succeed. Both are invariable parts of human nature, and they're exacerbated by unequal distribution of power, manifest in poverty and imperialism. Assuming an analogously pessimistic theory of human nature as highly suggestible and thus prone to evil, Beccaria speaks of the strong impressions made by the particular or perhaps self-centered passions which are ranged against the common good. The criminal is emotionally beholden to crime. Neither eloquence nor rhetoric, nor even the profoundest truths have succeeded in curbing for any length of time the passions excited by the vivid impact of actual objects. In light of this, retaliating for past wrongs is a futile attempt to rescue from time which never reverses its course deeds already perpetrated. Replicating Deodatus's shift from penalty to governance, Beccaria states that the purpose of punishment is none other than to prevent the criminal from doing fresh harm to fellow citizens and to deter others from doing the same. The figure likely standing between Thucydides and Beccaria is Hobbes, who argued for an anti-retributionist notion of punishment in Leviathan. His seventh law of nature states that in devising penalties, one should look not at the greatness of the evil past, but the greatness of the good to follow. Thucydides' influence on Hobbes was profound and self-acknowledged. While a particular case can be made, but has never been made, for the impact of Deodatus' speech on his view of punishment, I do not pursue it here, as there are good reasons to think that Beccaria was himself a reader of Thucydides. Intellectual evidence is particularly strong when we attend to their discussion of criminal hope. The Greek word elpis, expectation or hope, unlike words for hope in modern European languages, more often than not has negative connotations. Here is Martin Hammer's recent translation of the passage that I read above in Hobbes' version. Hope and desire are always ingredients of the force that drives criminals into dangerous risks. Where desire leads, hope follows. Desire develops the plan, and hope suggests that fortune will be generous, and both are ruinous, as their invisible influence is more powerful than the dangers in plain sight. Beccaria grafts the negativity of this ancient idea onto the homonymous Christian religious concept. Even the least of evils, when they're certain, always frightens man's minds, while hope, that heavenly gift that often is all we have, perhaps displaces everything else, always holds at bay the idea of greater evils, especially when hope is reinforced by the impunity that greed and weakness only too often afford. Elsewhere, he speaks of the seductive image of pleasure and hope, the sweetest deception of mortals, which they will swig large gulps of evil mixed with just a few drops of contentment. As suggested by the use of the same device, personifying the abstract idea of hope in their analysis of criminal affects, the continuity of content between Thucydides and Beccaria extends to the continuity of artistic form, style, and diction via shared social form, representations of human psyche. While Deodatus' argument is a striking premonition of the modern idea that deterrence, even to the point of preemptive surveillance, is the best way to control crime, it is rarely discussed in scholarship in the context of the long history of the death penalty. The most trenchant interpreter of this speech in the 20th century was Leo Strauss, who stated that it reveals more of Thucydides himself than does any other speech in the history. Yet his analysis takes an altogether different tack, focusing on what this speech might imply about public decision-making in general and occluding its own distinctive argument. Strauss held that Thucydides uses the speech by Diodotus to demonstrate the subterfuge that politicians must resort to under democracy, a regime in which one cannot benefit Athens without deceiving her. Taking it for granted that Diodotus is actually driven by humanitarian considerations, Strauss infers that the speaker must pretend that he replaces the question of justice, are the Mytileneans guilty, by the question of expediency. Does Athens derive benefit from killing them? Only later to reintroduce justice as a secondary consideration. In light of the parallel we have been exploring, Strauss's use of Thucydides to critique democracy is hardly compelling. Diodotus' utilitarian move is exactly the same as Beccaria's. Both subordinate justice to expediency, but see no difficulty in keeping them both in view. And while Beccaria was a consummate rhetorician, he was not addressing the demos, but he was addressing the enlightened monarchs of his day. There is one respect, however, in which the position of Diodotus differs from that of Beccaria. When the former says, in Hobbes' translation, that some greater terror than death must be devised to deter criminals, the reader is left to infer that such a feat is impossible, and the use of torture against citizens, even of other states, is unheard of in Thucydides. It follows that fear must have no part in crime prevention, according to Diodotus. What place punishment is to retain in legal practice remains uncertain, but in the case of unruly subject cities, as Diodotus makes clear, it is to be kept to a minimum. If we do have to put down a revolt, we should restrict the blame as narrowly as possible. Beccaria, by contrast, claims to have found such a greater terror in perpetual hard labor. From the modern perspective, molded by the carceral continuum described by Foucault, Diodotus's polemic against the very idea of penalty appears extreme, so much so that Strauss even calls it preposterous. By bidding the Athenians not to kill the Mytileneans on the ground that capital punishment is bad altogether, he preposterously bids them simultaneously to abolish capital punishment for murder, impiety, high treason, and other heinous crimes. There are, however, good reasons why Diodotus' critique of punishment should be taken seriously. Thucydides makes Diodotus, of whom we otherwise know nothing, so in this case not only the speech, but the speaker may be fictional, win an argument against Cleon, the most powerful Athenian politician at the time, a negative personage in the history and an object of ridicule in Aristophanes comedy. So I would concur with Strauss' intuition that this speech, which is also the portion of the history that comes closest to Philosophia, as we note from Plato and his followers, predating Plato a little bit, indeed conveys an argument that Thucydides held dear. The hermeneutic key can be found in a work by Antiphon, an intellectual who belonged to the group conventionally designated as the sophists and often misjudged based on their highly tendentious representation in Plato. More writings by Antiphon have come down to us than by any other sophist, because he combined theoretical speculation with work as a professional logographer, legal speechwriter. Antiphon was also involved, according to Thucydides, as the main actor in the organization of the oligarchic coup in Athens in 411. On this basis, he was condemned to death by the demos, and the speech he delivered on that occasion, again according to Thucydides, was the best one spoken in my lifetime by a man defending himself on a capital charge. Antiphon, in his real apologia, available in the author's version, both to his contemporaries and, if only through fragments comprising a few sentences to us, represent overlooked prototypes for Socrates, condemned to death by the demos 12 years later, and for his fictional apologies, of which we have the ones by Plato and Xenophon. We also owe it to Plato's Menexenus, a parody of Pericles' funeral oration from Thucydides, a rather unambiguous hint that Thucydides actually studied with Antiphon. Thanks to a papyrus find, we are in a position to comment on Antiphon's own theory of punishment. Of principal significance is for fragment 44, first edited in 1915, which contains a section of antiphons on truth. There we learn that the laws of the city are mere appendages, epitheta, to the laws of nature, and that one should adhere to the former only when there are witnesses around. In particular, justice, dikaiosune, is a political concept, something agreed upon without grounding in nature. These claims seem to come close to the moral relativism attributed to the sophists by Plato. This, however, is an illusion, as Antiphon in fact speaks in favor of universalizing cosmopolitanism. In his view, nature equates the Hellenes and the foreigners. If one breaks the laws of a city, such as a law instituted by the Athenian demos, and escapes unnoticed, one is free of both shame and punishment. If, however, one does violence beyond the measure of the possible to something implanted by nature, the evil is neither any less if one should escape the notice of all mankind, nor more should all see it. For one is harmed not by common opinion, doxa, but by the truth. The opposition between doxa and aletheia applies in epistemology that points forward to Plato. The tenor of protests dominates the following passage, where the laws of the city are attacked for infringing on the territory of nature, legislating to the eyes what they should and should not see, to the tongue what it should and should not say, to the feet where they should and shouldn't go, and to the mind what it should and should not crave. As Antiphon clarifies, what the laws of the city dictate is neither more nor less dear to one's nature, suspending the notion that the aim of the legislator is to hold in check the worst appetites ingrained in humanity. Instead of Plato's dualism, we have a theory that anticipates something like the Stoics' benign account of nature. Fragment 44 then suddenly veers to the question of life and death. Both lie in the domain of physis, or nature. Whatever helps life is expedient, while death comes from what is not expedient. The category of the expedient, tax sum feronta, trumps that of justice, as it does in that of speech. A further complication is introduced with the distinction between two kinds of expediency. One is imposed on nature by laws as fetters, while the other is in accord with nature in a free, unconstrained manner. The example of the latter is our striving to prefer pleasure to pain. The example of the former is a person treating one's parents well, or treating well those who have treated one badly. Such acts, Antiphon notes, one might find to be hostile to nature because there is less pleasure where there could have been more. It is a question of degree. Antiphon is not saying that there is no pleasure absolutely when one does well to one's own malefactors, and there is presumably joy in doing well to one's parents. So Antiphon placidly concludes that if the laws of a city would furnish further these kinds of behavior, curbing excessive egotism, they would not be unhelpful. This then is all the room that Antiphon gives to the lawgiver. We can infer that laws founded on exact or true comprehension of nature would lead to social concord, another important term for Antiphon, by regulating relative pleasures enjoyed by individuals. The trouble with the existing laws, as Antiphon states in On Truth, is that they are not contributing to any such concord, but instead promote forms of behavior that are unhelpful, disadvantageous, and not conducive to life. Now it appears that the justice that stems from the law does not supply adequate aid to those who strive after such things, such as treating one's malefactors well and never initiating violence, as this justice leaves the victim to suffer and the perpetrator to do the deed. And neither at this point would it hinder the victim from suffering, nor the perpetrator from doing the deed, nor when it is delayed until the time of penalty does it belong to the victim any more than to the perpetrator, for whatever the victim would say is left also for the perpetrator to deny. At this point, the precious papyrus peters out, but this sentence is enough to suggest how decisively Antiphon strikes at the retributionist theory of penalty, which was to supply the foundation to the Aristotelian and Thomist ethics and the subsequent Western penal systems. Justice that arrives after the harm is done in order to do more harm, and sometimes not even to the guilty party, should be replaced by a system that hinders citizens from engaging in violence to begin with. In Antiphon's fragment 44, as well as in the speech of Diodorus and Thucydides, we catch a glimpse of an alternative approach to the management of crime that aims to preempt rather than perpetuate violence. In both texts, as well as in Beccaria, justice is kept at arm's length because it is an added-on, polis-specific element, a social construct. Expediency, by contrast, is construed so broadly as to include everything that makes human beings thrive. In this light, the argument that any penalty is unnatural because it only does more harm no longer appears preposterous as it did to Strauss. As for the death penalty, it is a particularly egregious affront against nature. We do not know if Antiphon developed any of these ideas in his Apology, which Thucydides' praise notwithstanding failed to impress the Athenian jurors, but there seems to be little doubt that Thucydides let Diodorus echo a theoretical argument against the death penalty that was made by an intellectual who himself lost his life at the hands of the city's laws. Antiphon was a key interlocutor for Thucydides, but his ideas were unknown to Hobbes or Beccaria. In a similar way, Beccaria has been read for centuries without any appreciation for the likely impact of Thucydides on his thought. The ancient precedent to Elizabeth's policy, which was Beccaria's other inspiration, for a long time remained unknown, this time for reasons of cultural or civilizational myopia. By placing these figures within one transhistorical group and letting them speak to one another, it becomes possible to reclaim the abolition of the death penalty from the carceral continuum described by Foucault. An explanation for this reform is to be sought not in the demonization of the delinquent, but in the efforts to rethink all crime as something extrinsic to human nature, and indeed as a provocation to correct the wrongs inherent in society. Such a theory, it turns out, was available in classical Athens, and then again as a distant offshoot of Beccaria's work in the last 2 centuries when it came to guide legal practice throughout Europe. And I'm close to concluding. In his American Discourses on a New System of Society, Robert Owen asserted that individuals were always formed by the circumstances, and so total remaking of society was possible, there and then, if only universal charity, benevolence, and kindness may be made to become the ruling principles in the government of mankind. What would ensue is a revolution from a system in which individual reward and punishment has been the universal practice to one in which individual reward and punishment will be unpracticed and unknown except as a grievous error of a past wretched system. A revolution, moreover, that would be immediate and almost instantaneous. Assured that he possesses a correct knowledge of the constitution of our nature, Owen promised to transform the inhabitants of the United States in one generation into a race of very superior beings. Reflecting on the writings and the personality of Owen, whom he met as an old man, Alexander Herzen in 1860 reconsidered the utopian promise of socialism in light of the newly gained awareness that human nature, evidently not so easily reformable, is not a universal constant, but subject to the slow pace of evolutionary time. He concurs with Owen's view that the very idea of punishment is absurd. Although it is society that by a series of ineptitudes leads one to commit the crime, the penalty is imposed not on how society is organized, but on the individual. Yet humanity, according to Herzen, must morph into a new, freer species to be capable of recognizing the truth behind Owen's ideas. It must learn to breathe in a different element, like a marine animal that leaves the ocean for land. To be reconciled, this is Herzen, with the fact that it is ignoble and foolish for the whole society to take revenge on a criminal, that it is despicable and useless to inflict on the criminal collectively, without risk and in cold blood, as much villainy as he has committed under dangerous conditions and under the influence of affect, this is terribly difficult. Not up to our gills. Не по жабрам. Furthermore, there is no certainty that the animal is even headed for land. As Herzen's passionate obituary turned essay on Owen shows, a social reformer's trust in collective forces must be replaced, or it is supplemented, by the day-to-day work of forging intellectual alliances of individuals, dead and alive, whose voices, while remaining distinct autoritates, might at some point in history make a difference. Thank you. Спасибо за внимание. Извините, я, кажется, немножко долго говорил, но начали мы тоже позже.
Да, Борис, большое спасибо. Мы начали, да, в 10 минут, поэтому у нас еще есть немного времени на вопросы, какую-то рефлексию аудитории, как, простите за тавтологию, в аудитории, так и в Zoom. Вот. Есть ли какие-то вопросы? Да, Никита.
Я задам на русском, да, еще можно? Меня слышно?
Да, пожалуйста.
Ну, достаточно как бы сложная аргументация, и, возможно, она местами показалась как бы сложнее, чем я сейчас представлен. Насколько я понимаю, как бы в ответ на... Ну, это немного как и уточнение самого представленного материала и, соответственно, вопрос к нему. Что трансисторическое сообщество всегда как бы помещено в какой-то практический контекст. И поэтому нам бессмысленно говорить о зависимости в виде цивилизационной преемственности или чего-то подобного. И трансисторическое сообщество формируется в результате новой интерпретации текстов, ну, в такой духе гадамеровской интерпретации того, что как бы каждое новое поколение приходит со своими предубеждениями, связанными с практическими какими-то нуждами, и включает как бы в большое сообщество свои интерпретации, которые как бы влияют на, в ответ уже влияют на практики, как, например, на практики смертной казни. Это, соответственно, вот первый как бы вопрос.
Ага, да.
Правильно ли я понимаю?
Да, вот с небольшой только корректировкой, что да, есть какие-то общие, ну, характеристики, да, того, как мы работаем с текстами, которые определяются историко-культурными обстоятельствами, отчасти мы детерминированными, да, каждое поколение приносит что-то новое, но мне кажется, что мы должны подчеркивать те моменты, когда отдельный автор двигается против движений, которые как бы вот в той или иной степени являются коллективными. То есть то, что я сейчас говорил, на самом деле, это большой аргумент, попытка показать некоторые недостаточность привычных вот того, как нас приучают в университетах думать об истории, да. Речь идет не о контексте, который детерминирует членов того или иного поколения, да, или той или иной культуры, а речь идет, в общем, достаточно свободном выборе того, как мы выстраиваем эти ориентиры. И тот же Беккария действует контринтуитивно. Он выбирает себе собеседников вот совсем не так, как можно было бы ожидать. И совсем не так, как было бы удобно его современникам. Именно поэтому как бы текст не сработал сразу. Он оказался никому не нужен. Именно как предложение реформы, да, прошло, ну, по сути, 2 столетия, пока, когда этот текст заработал. Поэтому, как бы, если мы говорим о контексте или о поколении, то непонятно, как его ограничивать. Удобнее говорить об индивидах, которые, ну, обладают некоторой свободой выбора. Как они, с кем они будут общаться, какие тексты они будут читать.
Да, и у меня следующий, как бы, вытекающий вопрос из этого, как раз-таки Дмитрий Яковлевич в Zoom есть, и, ну, у него же, у вас, Дмитрий Яковлевич, есть статья о Радищеве, который сам, как бы, создает некоторое трансисторическое сообщество работы с понятием присутствия. И вопрос, как бы, следующий, того, что, ну, и он оказывается примерно в той же ситуации, что, как бы, его попытка, его аргумент, его, как бы, текст в какой-то мере в момент не срабатывает. Ну, в том плане, что он не то чтобы не срабатывает как аргумент, а он плохо сказывается на самом Радищеве. И из-за этого, как бы, у нас как будто бы возникает 2 параллельных образа трансисторического сообщества. Или как бы несколько возможных существующих параллельно, как бы, ну, не воображаемых, как бы публики, читателей, которые интерпретируют текст. И у нас есть, как бы, какие-то новаторские движения, как вот вы, Борис Павлович, описываете с одами, когда оды перестают посвящаться, как бы, королям, а становятся, ну, как буквально как Радищев, который пишет оду вольности. И вот эти вот попытки, как бы, создать трансисторическое сообщество, они, как бы, не срабатывают в какой-то мере. И
Понимаете, они не срабатывают в любой определенный момент времени. Так они не должны срабатывать, потому что они трансисторические. Если у вас что-то сработало прямо сейчас, мы сейчас все объединимся, и сейчас все пойдем менять мир, вот все 7 человек, которые сейчас в Zoom меня слушают, это будет не то, что нужно. Это будет не трансисторическое сообщество, это будет какая-то ерунда. Это будет политика, может быть, это, может быть, будет смешно, это, может быть, будет очень актуально, но это не будет тем, о чем я пытался рассказывать. Как это все переходит в сферу политики, интересный вопрос, но и вы про это знаете не меньше, чем я этим не занимаюсь. Но я пытаюсь уловить вот это как некоторую парадоксальность. Нам нужна несинхронность для того, чтобы создать те смыслы, которые в какой-то момент почему-то срабатывают. И эта синхронность создается людьми, которые свободно и часто совершенно нетривиально выбирают себе собеседников среди, вот приходят в библиотеку, берут книжку. И это относится к Фукидиду, которого никто никогда не соотносил с Беккари, по той простой причине, я просто про это не мог рассказать, что Фукидид считается не каноническим автором для XVIII века. Очень важный для Гоббса, очень важный для XIX века, а вот в XVII веке никто его якобы не читал. Но так вот это тоже не так. Можно показать, что его читали прежде всего для того, чтобы научиться сочинять хорошие речи, да, вот с точки зрения риторики. Но, видимо, так Беккари и набрался вот этих идей. Ну, то есть, опять-таки, мы выходим за пределы канона, а вовсе не повторяем бесконечно, как Слезкину хотелось бы, одно и то же.
Да, спасибо. Так, мне кажется, гораздо яснее выглядит.
Спасибо за вопрос. Угу.
Да. И вот тут еще от Дмитрия Яковлевича вопрос в чате, я его зачитаю вслух. Уважаемый Борис Павлович, спасибо за интересный доклад. У меня вопрос. С какой научной парадигмой можно соотнести вашу концепцию трансисторизма? Есть ли у этой концепции предшественники?
Но на самом-то деле тут ответ простой. Это такой отчаянный вопль гуманитария, окруженного социальными науками и получившему, в общем, образование как гуманитарий под влиянием социальных наук. Ничего нетривиального в этом нет. Просто как только мы начнем пытаться выстраивать нашу эпистемологию, исходя из того первичности одного человека, а не социальной группы, то вот что-то такое у нас получится. То есть это как бы непроговоренные вещи, которые, в общем, на поверхности-то лежат. Как это как бы ни странно, если вы гуманитарий. Но сами наши коллеги, которые занимаются социальными науками, они понимают, что-то такое все равно нужно. То есть мы не можем просто прийти, взять методологию социальных наук и решить, вот спасибо, значит, вот так вот надо работать. Потому что мы тем самым обделили наших коллег. Мы должны что-то им принести тоже взамен, чтобы они что-то у нас узнали от нас новое. Вот это такая как бы, да, ну да, большая, может быть, парадигма, ну, немножко более, ну, в принципе, если искать конкретных авторов, то, конечно, Бахтин очень важная фигура, который говорил, что наша цель — освободить автора из контекста, спасти его от контекста, потому что Шекспир всегда больше, чем его эпоха, интереснее. И чем он дольше как бы его читают, тем он становится интереснее. Почему? Вот такой ответ на вопрос уважаемого Дмитрия Яковлевича.
Спасибо большое. Очень интересно. Об этом можно дискутировать дальше.
Вам спасибо. Мне кажется, мы исчерпали уже все лимиты, все субботний вечер хотят отдыхать, а не дискутировать. Так что найдем способ другой поговорить.
Да, спасибо большое. Но в конце концов, академическая дискуссия – это тоже своего рода отдых. Да. Борис Павлович, большое спасибо. Спасибо, Дмитрий Яковлевич, что тоже к нам присоединились. Спасибо всем слушателям, всем участникам. На этом мы завершаем третий день работы нашей секции «Политическое сообщество по ту сторону аналитической континентальной философии». Всем спасибо и всех приглашаем на четвертый день завтра.
Большое спасибо.
Спасибо большое. Всего доброго.
Спасибо. Спасибо, очень интересно.
Спасибо.